Eddie, you've been fighting for a while, and I think it's time that Asia saw the dog in you. What about us taking an adventure east? Like Queens? Singapore, easy fights. Don't you want to meet my backers? Wait, the Chatri you're talking to is Chatri Sicheon Dong? What, you guys know him or something? Hell yeah, girl, he's just the richest man in all of Singapore. These people aren't just rich, they're crazy rich. What's up, Fight fans? It's your boy Jack Slack. Fights Gone By podcast episode 104, 23rd of October 2018. And quite luckily, we're coming back to Fight Time. The next, I believe, 8 weeks we've got UFC events, which is terrific. And of course, there'll be the usual Bellator smattering throughout that. And some interesting news broke this week regarding ONE FC, as our cold open preamble will have warned you. We'll be talking about that a little bit. And of course, some interesting news coming out of the UFC. So we'll be doing some news, some questions, previewing the big show on the weekend, and maybe even talk about the Danny Jacobs fight if we get time. And then I'm going to do a new segment called You Seen Shit, which is going to be about stuff that I was watching this week, because I thought that's an interesting way to, just introduce people to weird shit that's going on. So we'll talk extensively about ONE FC, ONE Championship as it is now, for probably the first time in this podcast's history in a couple of minutes. But first we'll cover the UFC news, because some of it's kind of important and some of it's kind of annoying. In the annoying category, Luke Rockhold's out of UFC 230, that cursed rematch with Chris Weidman. Obviously, it's a weird one, that fight, because it's remembered as like this one-sided arse-whooping, but until Weidman did a really stupid spin kick and put himself on the floor with Luke Rockhold on top of him, it wasn't. It was a good competitive fight. So I was always interested in the rematch, but they finally got it together. Seems like 5 years on, but managed to fuck it up again. So the UFC scrambled, because obviously UFC 230, not a great card to begin with, but that was one of the strong bits on it. They lost the Diaz versus Poirier fight. They lost to Jari Eubanks, obviously. And basically they scrambled to get Jacare out of his fight with Dave Branch. Dave Branch kind of sucks for him, because he's been asking for that fight, or Yoel Romero, or basically anyone scary he's been asking for forever. And he had the fight with Jacare. He was training for the fight with Jacare. Now he loses Jacare, gets Jared Cannonier, who is a dangerous opponent in his own right, but you're not going to get half the props for beating Cannonier that you're going to get for beating Jacare. I mean, Dave Branch, not a top guy, not a truly elite of the best guy, but if there's one thing you can say about him, is he's absolutely fearless, and could certainly give some of these guys trouble. But he's getting towards like 39 now, so he really needs to have something happen if he hopes to make a title run at some point before he has to retire. But anyway, enough sadness for Dave Branch. At least we've got a fight there in Weidman versus Jacare, which is something we've not seen before. So, at least it's fresh. Not ideal that they're doing it on fairly short notice, but, both of them agreed to it. And I hope they're getting a big payday out of it. Other UFC news, John Anik inks a 4-year deal with the UFC to continue commentary. That's good. I mean, I like Anik a lot. He's my boy, but, I think people have turned a corner on him. They used to think that he was like a robot. And, of course, if you come in after Mike Goldberg, who is literally just stuff shouted at weird intonations, you're going to sound kind of dull. But he's hilarious. He's low-key, deadpan funny. Doing things like pointing out that Adelaide Bird is on commentary just so that DC and Joe Rogan can riff for a bit on that. And lines like the legendary John McCarthy draws the reffing assignment for this one, and the legendary Jenny Andrade draws the round 1 card assignment. Or even better one that I heard the other day when I was writing about James Vick versus Justin Gaethje. James Vick, working at Alliance, wants that one-on-one attention, and you know that Lloyd Irvin will give it to him. Which, if you know anything about Lloyd Irvin, is kind of funny. Some people get upset about, the kind of joke that is, but that kind of joke brought the Bill Cosby thing back into the spotlight. So, won't go too much into that. You got to, read up on that on your own. But Lloyd Irvin, I don't want to get into an argument with Lloyd Irvin's alternate account on Twitter again. He has a main account where he's got, where he's marketing guru Lloyd Irving, and everything is retweeted 60 times, but nothing else. No likes, no comments, no replies, or anything. And then he's got the actual account that he uses, which is just him being angry, and it's called like Lloyd Irving Truth. And he has to act like someone else is controlling that account, some big Lloyd Irving fan, but there aren't any, with the exception of the what's his name, the Avalans. Danny Sexbang, no, the Avalan, the jiu-jitsu blokes, who sell world-class mindset, which will bring us on to Chatry Sichuan Dog in a minute. But good that Anik's back. Good that Mike Goldberg isn't weaseling his way back in. I like Goldberg as a person, but if you go back to the old events and then the newer events, it is very clear that he did not give a shit about his job. He actually got worse as the years went on. Someone pointed out maybe he just doesn't like MMA, which I could totally believe, but his work with Bellator and with John McCarthy has been staggeringly bad. Can we contractually extend his absence, is what I'm asking. Other news, Bellator 209 is going to be on tape delay. This one was one that hit people in the gut because obviously DAZN really making waves now. They just signed Canelo Alvarez to an enormous deal. They got so much stuff that they announced this week going on. But Bellator is tape delaying 209 on Dacian. I love saying Dacian. Presumably so that they can keep it tape delayed on Paramount because Paramount wants it tape delayed. And this is that danger when you're on multiple networks or multiple things. You have to, you're going to be trying to appease one the entire time. And then the big one this week. Eddie Alvarez inks, quote, an 8-figure deal with ONE FC, or One Championship. Sorry, I'm going to keep calling them ONE FC by accident, but you know that I mean One Championship. Now, this is interesting because, I love Eddie, personally. He's an absolute boy. Have had very good conversations with him in the past. And, of course, am a massive fan of his fights. No one deserves massive paydays and towards their retirement as they fight softer opposition than Eddie Alvarez. I don't mind that he's going over there to fight effectively nobody and for the promise of millions of dollars, but an 8-figure deal, if you're not including like after the decimal point, which you could well, but if you're not including after the decimal point, that's $10 million minimum over however many fights, and he said that it wouldn't take him that long to fulfill the contract. It's stuff. Eddie got angry at, I think it was Snowden, joking about this, but I'm not calling Eddie Alvarez a liar. I believe that he would take that. Who wouldn't take that sort of deal? I just am very suspicious of One Championship, and I have been for a while. But I like the product, but I sort of lost track of it because I realized very early on, oh wait, the guy who owns Evolve also owns One Fighting Championship or One Championship, and Evolve fighters seem to get like favorable matchups. There's an awful lot of stuff done for Evolve fighters. When you add to that the amount of announcements that they just make for positive PR, these people who love anything that Bellator does or someone like that just because it's not the UFC, they gobble up any announcement that Chatry and ONE FC make. Chatry's got like a friend at Forbes or Forbes Asia who just publishes hundreds of articles about ONE FC, and you're like, why is UFC never in Forbes? And ONE FC really must be this giant, but it doesn't seem that way. Like, it's super weird. I mean, we could talk about some of the sketchy stuff about ONE FC, which again, some of this is like rumors, some of this is just, it's not ultra sketchy, but some of it is sketchy, but like the weigh-in thing, they took credit for like having fixed weigh-ins, or rather fixed the weight cutting problem, by having this minimum amount that, or in the week up to it, they check hydration levels and you're not allowed to gain so much weight as a percentage, which is all well and good, great, but they do everything behind closed doors with no media invited, which means that they could just be talking out their arse. And especially when you have someone like Angela Lee, their Atomate champion, coming in huge, it kind of draws attention that you're being really opaque, with the press. And I don't want to be like Theresa May justifying spying on people. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. But, some level of transparency, because there is no commission there sorting things out. So at least have the open weigh-ins. And, for every other fight company, the weigh-ins are part of the spectacle. You can get that involved and have an extra day that people go and enjoy, or some stuff that makes the news and amps people up for the fight. But ONE FC have, no interest in that. or one championship. Fuck's sake. But the other thing is like the billion-dollar valuation that they had recently. If you compare that to other billion-dollar companies, it's pretty suspect, especially as they've made 8-figure losses for like the last 3 years. I mean, Bloody Elbow did a big... John Nash, who's a great writer, and I often get credit for his Nick Diaz, the pugilist piece way back in the day, which I think was before I even started writing. But Hey Not the Face on Twitter, he's a very, very good writer. I've known him for quite a while. And he did a piece just looking at the one championship financials, and I'm not in a financial field. I understand. The real excuse that people bring out immediately is you've got to spend money to make money. But one has made a 8-digit loss in the past 3 years, and it's gone up every year. At some point, a company has to start making money to be a worthwhile investment. They have all these venture capital guys leaping in to give millions and millions of dollars, but millions and millions of dollars was going into ACB, and we're also super suspicious about them. It gets more interesting when you go into like the details of the breakdown, because obviously one is advertised as like a colossus in Asia. The UFC during their anti-monopoly suit have been like, well, we can't break into Asia because ONE FC is the monopoly over there, so we're not really a monopoly. But they seem to be playing it up just for the sake of the monopoly suit. I don't think I've ever heard them mention it before that, to be honest, but if you look at the numbers that they're giving for the gates, they're really not impressive. Compared to, say, like Bellator's European gates, which consistently surprise you. Like, wow, they're making millions at the gate. Whereas it seems like one is making a couple of million at the gate over the year, which is already offset by what they're paying to, Eddie Alvarez. They just offered, I think it was Nikki Holskin, maybe Muang Thai. They were talking to Giorgio Petrosian. There was news on that a little while ago. So they're getting all these guys in all of a sudden. And they're talking about rapid expansion. I think it was last week I read something about them wanting to do 120 events a year, so 2 events a week. But again, half of these news stories just come out to draw attention. Chatri Sejongdong, I kind of like him as a person. I actually claim to fame, Chatri Sejongdong follows 500 people on Twitter, and I'm one of them. But he seems like a sort of Tai Lopez figure. The Tai with an H, Lopez, if you will, where a lot of his wealth seems to come from projecting the image of wealth and offering to sell you part of that wealth. I'm not saying he's like a, I will give you my 18 millionaire secrets for $50 kind of guy. Like that who's that twat that Joe Rogan had on and London Real? Dan something or other. Basically, his grift is selling people his image. Well, it's fair enough. I mean, Donald Trump's whole thing is the projection of wealth, even when he had no money and, was massively in debt. But yeah, Chatri his whole thing seems to be projecting this image of wealth and attracting investors. And if you look at, like, one's financial reports on this Bloody Elbow article, you'll notice that almost no money comes at the gate, which is expected because most of their shows are... Well, Singapore is incredibly wealthy. I know that from Crazy Rich Asians. But... they go places like Jakarta and Indonesia, which aren't tremendously wealthy places. So they're not making a ton of money at the gate. They're also not making a ton of money through sponsorships. The sponsorships on them are no better than, like, I don't know, the UFC's even, or Bellator. And if you look at their breakdown, all their, like, big money comes through weird bartering deals and shit. It's just Chatri being like, inject more money into my company, please. Again, not a financial expert, but I was just reading this and going, this is really... To be fair, any fight company, I expect them to lose a ton of money, and I expect, alarm bells go all the time for me, because the constant trouble with fight companies is, especially with the UFC established as a monopoly, or, don't want to get sued as whatever they are, such a prominent figure, and having so many of the best fighters in the world, it's very hard to become anything above like a B-tier promotion, and as soon as guys start expanding and bringing in top talent, it seems that they all go downhill really fast. The old one used to be you would you'd secure a load of funding, you'd have a couple of events, you'd go, okay, cool, we're going after Fedor, and you'd pay Fedor like $2 million per fight and offer him like co-promotion with M1 back when he was part of that, and suddenly you tank your promotion. And there's other shady stuff about One Championship, they love the Lees, and to be fair, the Lees are very entertaining. Angela and Christian, I think. They're siblings and they're champions in various divisions in one. Chatri is always like, yeah, she could waltz over and beat Joanna Jędrzejczyk anytime. Like, no, she couldn't. She can barely beat these people that no one's ever heard of. Well, she does actually convincingly beat them, but she can barely make weight for it, allegedly. But yeah, so like Christian Lee suplexed Kotetsu Boku, who is a good fighter, by the way. It's suplexed Kotetsu Boku and finished him. And then later, some other fighter hit a suplex. I think it was an On and Evolve fighter, but I'm not sure about that. Hit a suplex, knocked the guy out from the suplex and the ground and pound. And then the next day, Chatri announced that he had decided suplexes were illegal, so the suplex from the previous night was now a DQ. Which just doesn't work. That's like when we shit on ACB changing the results of fights just on what they like. If it's illegal and you can retroactively give out DQs, then Christian Lee's was just as illegal. Either and the weird part was like, you could have just gone, well, this one landed slightly differently, la la la. Give them the 12-6 elbow bollocks that referees are always coming out with, where they excuse completely ignoring 12-6 elbows by being like, well, there was an arc to it, and there's not actually any difference in the film, but you're like, I don't know. Okay, cool, have that. If you'd said like, oh, he suplexed him on the back of his head, whereas Christian Lee landed more on the shoulder, and both of them like really hurt the guy that landed, so that would be farcical anyway, but you could at least get away with that. He just said all suplexes are now illegal, which means that Christian Lee's was just as illegal, but they're playing that in highlight reels and being proud of it. So a very, very strange company. Actually, looking at his record since then, Christian Lee suplexed his last opponent and was DQ'd for it. So, I mean, at least they're staying consistent to it, but you can't overturn the result of a fight the night before by changing the rules. You can, if you're Chantry and you own the thing, but just super weird. I think the main thing is that, like, most fight companies, I suspect, money laundering an awful lot of the time. I'm like, why is all this money going in when there's almost no return? But I always like to think about what Deborah Meadham or Duncan Ballantyne would say if you took this idea to them on Dragon's Den. You say, like, I've got this idea that I'll do something that already exists worse, and it costs more for us to do it, and we're going to offer an inferior product with higher costs than the market leader. There's a great Maggie Thatcher quote which applies very well to just fight promotion generally. I think it was about fight promotion. She said, the problem with running a fight promotion is that you run out of other people's money to spend. And in between that, she was scoffing and saying, burn the poor. It wasn't like one complete statement. But I think it holds true. Just like the UFC's situation was very much unique. People are always like, well, they were 55 million in the hole before the Ultimate Fighter took off. But they had so many advantages, like the fact that basically no one else could get an event licensed in Las Vegas until the Fertittas bought the company. Allegedly, there's an awful lot of allegedly in here. But they basically turned something that was borderline illegal and assumed to be on the way out into a product again. Whereas one is getting into a field where all the best fighters are already somewhere else. And even if they buy good fighters in, they have to pay so much for them, like Eddie Alvarez, and have fucking nobody for him to fight. And then the word today is that Ben Askren is like 90% sure he'll be fighting in the 98% sure he'll fight in the UFC soon. Which, of course, take that with a massive grain of salt because he's Ben Askren. And I assume he's still got some kind of existing contract with one, and that's why he retired rather than just going on to Bellator. But, it says something that the one guy we thought Eddie could fight reasonably is already talking about jumping ship. In terms of, what he wants from his future rather than him jumping ship to avoid Eddie Alvarez. But anyway, we've done 20 minutes on how weird ONE FC is. let's do the new segment I'm calling You Seen This Shit? Which is stuff I watched this week. Number one, I watched a Swedish cop low sweep some person. They were blurred, so I couldn't see who they were. But basically, there are two people fighting somewhere. One's on top of the other. This Swedish cop runs in, spear tackles the guy off the top, and like holds him down. And the person who was just on the ground gets up. They're completely blurred by the video footage, so I can't. It looks like a 90-pound woman, and it goes at him with the gait of a gleeful toddler. But he just, like, from a crouched position, he performs the Street Fighter low sweep, and just wastes this poor bint. Like, she goes down head first on the floor, and he's like holding them both down by the scruff of the collar. It was amazing. And you should definitely watch it. It made the rounds on all the martial arts groups on Facebook. I put up a tweet of the GIF. But yeah, Salat is real. All that stuff in Salat where you're on the floor doing kicks on the floor, and we're like, that's crazy. It's legit, provided the woman or the person is a woman who you outweigh by a large amount and is probably intoxicated and has no training. What else have I been watching this week? The Muay Thai fights. I've been watching a lot of Muay Thai lately. Muay Thai elbow highlight. I uploaded a GIF of that, but that guy is just monstrous with his elbows, constantly going after them, and gets hit on the chin a lot because he throws his head back when he elbows. The guy's an absolute madman. And then I went a little bit old school in exploring some Muay Thai stuff. Muay Thai's been making me really happy this week. I've just not been feeling MMA because nothing's going on. But I was watching Bunalai Saw Thanikal, I think that's his name, but Bunalai is what he's known as. Just fantastic. Got a really good jab, which you don't see much in Muay Thai. I don't know the history of glove sizes, but the gloves look a little bit smaller back then. In the way that, in boxing, heavyweights used to wear 8 ounces and now wear 12 ounces or whatever it is. I don't know if they changed that up, but yeah, he looked really sharp. Great jab. I was amazed how often and well he avoided the clinch by sidestepping or snapping the head down and pivoting offline. Really nice kicking game. I was watching him against Karahat, which was awesome. Very talented lad. But had some fight-fixing scandals late in his career, which sort of saw him snubbed a bit in popular memory. But definitely worth a watch. Bunalai. Boonlai. Right, let's do some questions and then we'll preview the event this weekend and then we'll get out of here. Hey there, Jack. In the interest of not supplying my own answers to the question before I even ask it, I'll try and keep this short and sweet. You and other analysts often provide quite cutting commentary of certain fighters' skill sets, and even champions exhibit seemingly obvious weaknesses. Does the multifaceted nature of MMA mean that even the best fighters in the world will always be laughably flawed in certain parts of their game? Keep up the snarky good work. From John. P.S. I'd like to make a hearty recommendation for Jeeves and Jericho's English breakfast. It's light and delicious. Cheers, John. I'll give it a go. English breakfast, or as we call it over here, bog standard. I think, it's very easy to get distracted because I see people every week being like, oh, they talk about fighters like they're so obviously flawed, blah, blah, blah. But we're talking, I hope that everyone understands, we're talking about within the context of very, very good fighters. It's like if I were talking about American football, I would be talking about within the context of NFL players. I'd be like, he's a bit small or he's a bit weak because he can't bench press his, 250 100 times, whatever it is they do at the combine. But you are working within a context. If you took Edson Barbosa and you put him in the gym with, all the best wrestlers in most MMA gyms, I'm sure he'd be very, very hard to take down, very, very hard to keep down. However, there are... whoever you are, you cover your weaknesses in training by, taking shortcuts and things like that. There are always areas you can be drawn into where if you don't have the specific tools for it, your life will be very hard. So and a lot of it is choices too. So Edson Barbosa constantly standing along the fence, kicking to try and intercept people rather than boxing and moving offline. I mean, the subject line of this email is about perfect fighters, but there will never be a perfect fighter. You are always going to, people will always gravitate towards something, and often generalists. You're seeing that with the matchup between Conor McGregor and Habib Nurmagomedov. Neither of those guys is considered like a generalist. Habib's hands were better than expected. Conor's wrestling is good enough that he could go back and like smash through UFC 1 probably. But they still have a skill set that takes them into the areas in which they want to work. I think trying to be a generalist like the Fedor thing is a way to really make yourself look bad if you're not fighting people who are just generally much worse than you in every area. I mean, there's only so much time available to train and to learn and to live even, and I don't think it's possible to master that many things or that many specific skills in that time. You really have to streamline, find what you like, find what's really a problem for you and work on those specifically. So yeah, we'll, for years and years to come, in fact, until I die probably, we'll still be talking about weaknesses in fighters, and it will seem like, wait, he's not circling off the fence. We found out that was bad way back with Edson Barbosa 30 years ago. Grandpa Slack used to moan about it, but it's more like, think of like a skill tree if you want to do like a video game thing, but like, it's going to be, you have mastered things and not mastered others. There is never going to be a way where you can master everything at once. And, your fighting style will put you in danger of some things worse than others. If you do a lot of backing up, you're more likely to hit the fence. If you do a lot of moving forward, you are going to, be much more susceptible if the opponent starts throwing body shots. And so on and so forth. Cheers, John. Dear Jack, in my BJJ stand-up, I'm particularly fond of the upper body control, the 2-on-1/Russian tie-up, and arm drags. Do you think these kinds of control can find their use in MMA? And are there any interesting examples of that? As for the no-gi bottom game, if I'm not inverting for the Kiss of the Dragon, I'm probably thinking about inverting for the Kiss of the Dragon. Many MMA fighters remain on their knees when in half guard, but can reverse De La Riva be potentially useful against opponents who like to stand up when in guard? For example, it seems like Habib is occasionally putting himself in these positions. He linked some clips of that to me that are perfectly suited for this kind of guard. With the foot on the hip for maintaining distance and the upper arm acting as a shield, can it be relatively safe position? Deep half seems more dangerous, yet fighters go for it regularly and get pummeled. I feel that if the reverse De La Riva player is versed well in it, the person on top should be forced to constantly adjust their feet and thus be unable to strike effectively in order to maintain the position and prevent the guard player from getting underneath. Open guard is such a huge and well-developed part of BJJ, but very little of it translates into MMA. Is it just the lack of high-caliber sport BJJ competitors in MMA, or do punches change the game so much? My apologies for writing a novel and perhaps delving into too much detail. Thank you for your amazing work. It's only kisses, your Leandro Lo of Toriandoing Hose. Oh, nice. And the first diva of Reverse De La Riva, Nenad. Cheers, Nenad. Yeah, Reverse De La Riva... well, let's just start at the top. So, 2-on-1s and tie-ups. 2-on-1 tie-ups and arm drags. Very seldom seen in MMA because the clinches tend to be close clinches or striking. Basically, if the clinch is loose, there's striking happening. I could see you snatching up a 2-on-1 from collar tie, perhaps. But guys tend to focus. The worry of the knee is so much that guys tend to posture up and be focused entirely on getting out of the collar tie, and the guy holding the collar tie tends to desperately want to hold it rather than move to something else, which they will in wrestling, obviously. There's no advantage in wrestling to just grabbing the double collar tie and holding it. So I think that, that people aren't always reaching for your head and trying to hold it or steer you by it. Is probably one of the reasons you don't see it as much in MMA. You do see some guys who work on the wrist fairly well. John Jones against Daniel Cormier. Obviously John Jones is Marvel. He's not the average guy or the average MMA fighter, but equally Daniel Cormier is so good a wrestler that for John Jones to be able to use wrist control so effectively against him suggests that two fighters of much lower level could do the same to each other. And he was picking that up off moving into clinches and posting his head on Cormier for that infighting stuff, and also from Cormier grabbing the collar tie and trying to uppercut him. He'd just block the uppercut and then grab a hold of it. Not like Aikido style, but smother the uppercut and then work onto it. regarding reverse De La Riva, you are right. A lot of guys stay on the knees because you don't have to give any space back. Anytime you stand, if you're not applying very good pressure and almost on top of the opponent anyway, well, put it this way: anytime you stand, there is no physical pressure on the opponent, so they have the chance to stand up. And if you stay close, they also have the chance to kick you in the head. The up kick, you don't see many knockouts with it, but it is a constant worry. It's a constant concern. So being on the knees, taking away that up kick. If upkicking were legal on the knees, I think you'd see guys change the style of passing again. But as it is, you can go to your knees and you are safe from one of the most powerful strikes in the game. And the only really powerful strike from the bottom. You can watch someone like... actually, the Meowers are really interesting as grapplers because they don't particularly like being on the bottom of half guard, and they'll just bring their free leg up and start pushing the opponent back at the shoulder, which obviously requires some leg dexterity and flexibility, but they are able to sort of like push their opponent up and convince them to stand, or at least take the weight off the trapped leg and start peeking under it to get the reverse De La Riva / Kiss of the Dragon sweep going. But then again, like the point that you made about keeping people off balance and that should stop them striking is equally true of the deep half guard. When you say guys get smashed from the deep half guard, I don't think I've ever seen anyone strike effectively from like a leg straightened, the opponent underneath them in good deep half guard position. I see guys get smashed when they shoot in, underhook the leg and put the tight waist around the body, and then can't begin to turn and get the opponent out, kick the opponent's base out from their knees. They haven't made a counteraction to swing into the deep half guard. They just try and pull the other guy on top of them. And what happens is guys put their arm in and the opponent just kneels on it and starts elbowing their undefended head. That's when I see guys get smashed going for the deep half guard, rather than in the deep half guard itself, where your head, it is in between the opponent's legs, but there's not a lot of good strikes you can do straight downwards at your own crotch. And especially if you're being forced to put your hands on the floor either way. Watch someone like, even against Ryan Bader, Little Nog was a shambling mess, but I think he got into deep half guard once or twice, and just by keeping moving, he was doing well. And then you can watch his good performances against basically everyone from the start of his career. That deep half guard really kept him safe. He'd get the leg, he'd straighten it out, and then he'd always be moving backwards and forwards and tipping the opponent one way or the other. And I think a lot of guys make it into like a strength position too. If you watch Jones versus Shogun shoots in for the deep half guard and tries to pull John Jones over the top of him, and John Jones just posts those long ass arms and has no problem stopping it. Whereas if you watch Little Nog, he'll shoot in for a single and drop on it, or Damien Meyer, whenever he's coming up on a tight waist or anything like that, he'll take like a cross grip on the opposite wrist and then use his knee shield to kick the opponent over, like he's going to try and scissor sweep them, and then sit up into the underhook. I think anything can be made to work with the right setups, and if you keep the opponent off balance, but some things are going to be easier than others based on where they want to be. Because again, a lot of the grappling game is dictated by the top man, where they want to engage. If they come down to their knees, you can have a very hard time convincing them to stand up if you don't have like kicks and things to make them. And if they want to be on their feet, it's very hard to drag someone down. I mean, like Eddie Bravo has a little section in his book and on his web series about forcing someone down to a knee when they are standing to pass. But it's pretty... I'd say it's pretty hit and miss. Like, sometimes you can do it and sometimes you can't, depending on where their weight is. There's a great example. Is it Sean Roberts, the guy who's famous for the giggler? He was against Rodolfo in the gi, Rodolfo Vieira. And Rodolfo stands in his guard to pass, and he uses his instep on the inside of Rodolfo's foot and pushes it out and knocks him down to half guard, and then sweeps him from there, or almost sweeps him, I think. I think Rodolfo might post on his head and do crazy shit to get back in. But so yeah, there are ways to try and force people to stand and force people to stay down. But I think without actually hitting them with nasty up kicks, it's very hard to make someone stand up. Cheers, Nenad. Hello, Your Fistic Majesty. Love the podcast and have been watching since numero uno. Just wondering if you might give advice on how to punish/discourage someone from throwing kicks while I'm fighting on the back foot. Also, how would I deal with a longer, taller fighter while I'm fighting on the outside? Is there a way to stay on the outside, or do I have to close the distance? Any fighters that I could study that were short for their division had success on the outside. Cheers in advance from Woo. I would say Sanchai. I was thinking that from the beginning when he was saying how to stop someone from kicking anyone in the back foot, but Sanchai is a great example because he fights much bigger people. Obviously, Sanchai's a magician, but he does a lot of work on the very end of his opponent's reach, even though his reach is shorter than theirs. He'll wait for them to kick, pull back, and then charge in after the kick and catch them. So, yeah, any of his fights against taller opponents, particularly like, Western opponents, are a great example of that. But more than that, like, staying on the outside for a shorter man, you can make the opponent come to you. And if you can get them stepping, predictably, if you know they're going to step in, you just have to time ducking in under. It's not like going forward like Joe Frazier and taking a ton of jabs while you're trying to slip inside. You can work to the opponent's feet rather than their hands, which is a nice way to set up your counters or entries. Discourage the opponent from kicking when you're on the back foot. Have good takedowns. There you go. Like that's what discourages me from kicking people when I've got them in good position to kick. The thing about that is it's very the whole thing about being a kicker is that you probably want to try and get into a position where you can kick freely without worrying about the opponent stepping up the middle, and that is a lot easier when you're going forward and they're not. Either try and stay on the front foot or stay off the ropes and moving. Ropes or cage, depending on what you're sparring in. You can keep stepping back from kicks and avoiding them as long as you don't hit something behind you. So I would say focus on the ring craft. And if in doubt, just raise a knee and get inside, press in on them when they try and kick. Not the most pretty, but certainly can be more difficult for guys who just want to stand back and punt you. Cheers, Woo! Right, what we got going on this week? UFC Fight Night 138, Vulcan versus Smith, or Eyes Too Wide versus Eyes Too Narrow. I love it. The poster has fastest knockout 15 seconds and fastest knockout 22 seconds, really pushing the fast knockout angle. This reminds me of the Justin Gaethje versus James Vick one. 18 combined KOs, and Justin Gaethje has 15 of them. So what you're saying is Justin Gaethje's fighting a dude with 3 KOs. But what we got going on this card? Stevie Ray, always fun, jerking the curtain. Calvin Kattar's back against Chris Fishgold. Chris Fishgold, people very high on him. He's fresh off his Cage Warriors run. 17-1 overall, compared to Kattar's 18-3. So that's a pretty decent matchup. And certainly no joke coming in. Meanwhile, Kattar is coming off that loss to Renato Moicano, where it was really weird because he was touted as the great kickboxer, but he had no idea what to do when Moicano just kicked him every time he stepped in. He was trying to plant his foot and jab, because obviously to jab you have to have that lead foot out there. To box effectively, you have to have that lead foot out there ahead of you to bounce in and out off. But every time he planted it, Moicano kicked it, and then he was trying to work out a way to punch without putting his leg down first, which obviously doesn't exist. So it was pretty interesting watching him try and do that and fall over himself in the later rounds. So yeah, there you go. I put that down as possible FOTN, or possible standout performance of the night. If Fishgold comes in and finishes Kattar, that would be a huge name to have on his record. Easily the hugest on his record so far. Tibalt Golti versus Nasrat Hakparast, who you will remember as Halal Kelvin Gastelum. He just fought Mark Chikaze and absolutely put him through the ringer. He was cutting the ring beautifully. But yeah, I was very high on that guy after that fight. Really good fun. And Goatee's been around a while. Can't remember when he last fought. Nordine Taleb versus Sean Strickland. Fun enough. Court McGee's back versus Alex Garcia. And then you get to the main card, and you know how there's no talent in the light heavyweight division at the moment? We've got 3 light heavyweight fights on the card. You got Jean Vellante versus Ed Herman. Andrei Sikmateth versus Jonathan Martinez. It's 1-3-5, fun enough. Misha Serkinov, who is coming off those 2 losses, one to Volkan Ozdemir in very quick time, and then one to Glover Teixeira, who, is just beating down these young lads, or younger lads, while getting older and older, versus Patrick Cummins, who is always hit and miss. Co-main event, you got Artem Lobov. Why? But he's against Michael Johnson. So Johnson we talked about this last week. Johnson's a very dangerous dude. The 1813 record belies hides how good he is. You consider that he stopped Poirier, stopped Barbosa, or did he stop Barbosa? He certainly put him through the ringer and beat Tony Ferguson. I think he was the last man to beat Tony Ferguson. So very much a tough ask for Lobov. Perhaps punishment for the entire Khabib saga. And in the main event, you got Anthony Smith versus Volkan Ozdemir. Volkan Ozdemir, I would probably rate as the better or the more technical striker, having seen a little of both, to be honest. But against Daniel Cormier, which is the one he lost, obviously, I thought he was doing a good job of putting out the jab and trying to uppercut or hook off the jab with the same hand. And he was catching DC a few times. Smith is more of like a power striker who does well in the messy exchanges. But a fun enough card. I think I'll probably write something about one of those fights for Friday. I've written something about Danny Jacobs this week. Hopefully Vice will get that up soon. If you want to support the podcast and get in on the Patreon episodes, the new Opium War episode and so on, which is also largely to do with the Taiping, which is just wild, sign up to the Patreon and do so. If you want to send an email to the podcast, fightsgoneby@gmail.com. And if you want to check out what I'm up to, fightprimer.com has everything I ever do. Oh, and Battles of London Edition 2 is coming out soon, and I wrote a huge piece on the Marquess of Queensberry rules, and the Queensberrys generally, for that magazine, it was really fun to research, and I think you'll enjoy it a lot. I'm your boy Jack Slack, this is Fights Gone By podcast, and I will catch you next week. Cheers!